America built a truck so effective that troops inside it were up to 10 times more likely to survive an explosion that would normally kill everyone inside. Then, after spending nearly $50 billion building over 20,000 of them, they started giving them away. And in 2022, hundreds of these vehicles were suddenly shipped to Ukraine, right into the dangerous battlefields. So here's the question. How did this massive, life-saving machine go from urgent war necessity to surplus equipment to suddenly important again? And more importantly, was it one of the smartest military investments ever made? Or one of the most expensive overreactions in modern history? To understand that, we have to go back. Not to Iraq, but to a war most people have never heard of. Before the MRAP existed, armies had a deadly blind spot. Not tanks. Not missiles. Not even enemy soldiers. The real killer was what you couldn't see. Landmines. Roadside bombs. Hidden explosives. In Iraq alone, these attacks caused up to 70% of US casualties. Think about that. Not firefights. Not ambushes. The road itself became the enemy. And the vehicles American troops were using? The Humvee. Fast, mobile, but dangerously vulnerable. A single buried explosive could tear through it like paper. Soldiers knew it. Commanders knew it. But for years, nothing truly solved it. Until someone realized this problem had already been solved decades earlier. The story doesn't start in America. It starts in southern Africa during a brutal insurgency war. Guerrilla fighters were using stacked Soviet mines to ambush patrol vehicles. And traditional armored vehicles were failing. So engineers tried something different. Instead of just adding more armor, they redesigned the entire shape of the vehicle. Raised the body high off the ground. Added a V-shaped hull underneath. Designed it to deflect explosions instead of absorb them. The result? A strange-looking, almost awkward machine. But it worked. When a mine exploded underneath, the blast was pushed outward, away from the soldiers inside. This wasn't just an upgrade. It was a complete shift in thinking. And for years, the world barely paid attention. Until the US desperately needed it. When the US entered Iraq, the war they planned was not the war they got. Instead of conventional battles, they faced an insurgency built on IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Cheap to make. Easy to hide. Devastatingly effective. Troops tried everything. Welding scrap metal onto vehicles. Reinforcing doors. Adding armor kits. But it wasn't enough. Then came a new threat. Explosively formed penetrators, EFPs. These weren't just bombs. They were designed to pierce armor like a bullet. At that point, the problem became unavoidable. The military had two choices. Keep adapting old vehicles, or completely rethink battlefield transport. And that's when the MRAP entered the picture. The MRAP wasn't built slowly. It was rushed into existence. Fast. Urgent. Almost desperate. A small company adapted the older South African concept. And within months, the first MRAPs were deployed. The results were immediate and shocking. Some units reported surviving hundreds of explosions with 0 deaths. In some cases, soldiers walked away from explosions that completely destroyed any regular war vehicle. Let that sink in. 0. Suddenly, everything changed. What was once considered too heavy, too impractical, became the most important vehicle in the war. The US military launched one of the fastest production efforts since World War II. Multiple companies jumped in. Factories scaled overnight. And within a few years, over 24,000 vehicles built. Nearly $50 billion spent. The MRAP wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a lifeline. But here's where things get complicated. Because while the MRAP was saving lives, it was also creating new problems. It was huge, heavy, expensive, difficult to transport, and worst of all, it didn't fit the military's long-term vision. The US was trying to build a fast, flexible fighting force. The MRAP was the opposite. It was built for one specific type of war: insurgency. So critics started asking, what happens when the war ends? And when Iraq and Afghanistan slowed down? That question hit hard. But if you measure it in money, maybe not. But if you measure it in lives saved, it might be one of the most important vehicles ever built. Because in war, the side that survives longer wins. After the wars, the US was left with thousands of MRAPs. Too many. Way too many. Some were stored, sold, given to police departments. And thousands were simply destroyed. Imagine that. Thousands of them were shredded for scrap. Vehicles that had saved lives reduced to metal. Billions of dollars. Shredded. At that point, it looked like the MRAP had become a symbol of overreaction. A vehicle built perfectly for a war that didn't last forever. And then, everything changed again. In 2022, war returned to Europe. And suddenly, mines were everywhere again. Ambushes. Explosives. Dangerous terrain. The exact environment the MRAP was built for. So the US started sending them to Ukraine. Not as a backup, but as a critical tool. Because even in modern warfare, one truth hasn't changed. Survival still matters more than anything else. So was the MRAP worth $50 billion? If you measure it in money, maybe not. But if you measure it in lives saved, it becomes a very different answer. The MRAP proved something simple, but powerful. Sometimes the most important weapon in a war isn't the one that destroys the enemy. It's the one that keeps your people alive long enough to win. And that's why this truck still matters.